Our reading in Matthew's Gospel today gives us the description of the Last Judgment. It's hard to think of a religious concept that creates more anxiety when different folks make different claims about who might be in and who might be out. Over the past few weeks, as we reach the conclusion of Matthew's Gospel, we've studied a series of difficult passages leading up to this final discourse before the Last Supper and Jesus' arrest. In our Zoom discussions as a congregation, we've wrestled with the language in these passages, particularly in the parables of the wedding banquet, the 10 bridesmaids, and the talents. It can be difficult for us to hear Jesus speak of people being cast into outer darkness, of weeping and gnashing of teeth. In each case, we've examined the parable from several different perspectives. In each case, we've come to understand the importance Jesus places on our actions as his followers. In Mother Leila's sermon last week, she noted that these parables illustrate God's kingdom is coming, and we are called to help make it real on earth. Today, the concept of God's kingdom takes center stage. This is the last day of the church year, known as Christ the King Sunday. Today, the long season of Pentecost comes to a climactic close with the culmination of Jesus' teaching as he talks with the disciples just prior to his arrest and crucifixion. During these last few days with his closest companions, Jesus tries to prepare them for a future where he will be physically absent from them, and they will be the ones to carry on the work of his ministry. As the final reading in this series, we find yet another difficult passage, the judgment of the nations. Even the word judgment makes many people uncomfortable. The Last Judgment is an image that looms large in the Western Christian psyche. Centuries of literary and artistic renditions shape the way we view this event, perhaps even more than the text itself. We may think of Dante's Inferno, or Michelangelo's masterpiece in the Sistine Chapel, or perhaps Hieronymus Bosch's Last Judgment hellscape scene of demonic torture. Quite a few of us may have come to the Episcopal Church from religious traditions that misuse the concept of the Last Judgment to frighten people into obedience, threatening them with eternal damnation for their sins. Carrying all of this baggage, it's no wonder we feel some trepidation. When we look carefully at the text itself, we notice several remarkable aspects. All the nations, both Jew and Gentile, are assembled before Jesus, seated on his throne. But this king describes himself not as a lordly royal, but as a shepherd. And when Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, both groups seem surprised. There's no mention here of murder or adultery, of lies or coveting, or any other egregious sins. The only criteria he uses to separate the two groups is how they treated the poor and vulnerable in their midst. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. This account in Matthew is the only description of the Last Judgment found in the Gospels. It seems quite different from the popular images so familiar to us. Matthew's Gospel shows Christ the King as a shepherd with compassion for others at the heart of his message. Just as in the previous parables, Jesus emphasizes the importance of how we treat one another here and now. He underscores that discipleship involves doing this kingdom work of caring for all we encounter, especially those without the ability to fully care for themselves. We see this theme of compassionate action beginning with the Beatitudes and running throughout Matthew's Gospel. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven, Jesus says in Matthew 7:21. And in this glimpse today of the Last Judgment, Jesus draws distinctions based on the willingness of people to feed, clothe, visit, and welcome others. Commentator Catherine Matthews explains that gets to the heart of what the goats in this story did in response to God's call. Nothing. They just didn't do anything at all when they saw their sisters and brothers suffering. The sheep, on the other hand, respond to the gospel message by sharing God's abundant love, grace, and mercy with others. The reign of God begins with the life and ministry of Jesus. Although seated on the throne in this passage, Christ the King shows us an example of a kingdom that is unlike any other. When we think of royalty, we think of castles and crowns, jewels and scepters, power and wealth. Pontius Pilate, tongue-in-cheek, calls Jesus the King of the Jews as he is crucified. What kind of king is this? This king washes the feet of his followers. His purple robe is trimmed not in ermine, but in blood. His crown is made not of gold, but of thorns. Instead of taking shelter from his enemies behind castle walls, he walks vulnerably to the cross. Author Donald Craybill famously describes this as the upside-down kingdom. He writes, "In this kingdom, service, compassion, and persuasion replace dominance and command. The greatest are those who teach and do the commandments of God. In this kingdom, the first to enter are the outcast and marginalized." Jesus compares this kingdom to weeds and mustard seeds, to corrupting yeast, and to thieves sneaking in during the night. In these stories, we learn that when the tiniest bit of love enters in, it is enough to transform the whole world. The author of Ephesians takes up this theme as he writes to the church there, encouraging them as active participants in this kingdom work. He describes Jesus as over all things, the Lord of all, but his reign defies the world's dominating empires by lifting up the lowly. As the church, we all have a role in God's saving work. Transformation through love is the great hope to which the Ephesians were called, and the same inheritance that extends to us. In our daily lives, we see the kingdom is here among us, already here, just not yet in its fulfillment. Centuries after Jesus passed his ministry on to the disciples, We are now the ones carrying on the kingdom work of loving one another, of caring for one another, and passing on the faith until his return. On this final Sunday of the church year, as we turn our thoughts towards Advent and the Incarnation, let us remember that God chose to come among us as one of the least of these. Jesus was a person of color, born to an unwed mother. He grew up in a rural town, far from the pillars of power. He spent most of his ministry hanging around fishermen, tax collectors, and sinners. Jesus was at odds with religious leaders, but embraced by dusty crowds of people who were poor, weak, and infirm. As his followers today, Jesus invites us to look beyond outward appearances in order to see and care for the divine within each person. May we respond to his message just as the sheep did, with God's abundant love. It is in each other that we see the face of Christ the King.